You didn't lose your power when you went silent. You finally claimed it. For so long, you were speaking, explaining, proving, chasing, trying to make someone understand your value. But the truth is, people don't recognize value when it's constantly handed to them without effort. They recognize it when it's no longer available. And now, your silence is speaking louder than any words ever could. Because silence does something powerful. It removes distraction. It removes the noise. It removes the comfort they once had in avoiding responsibility. And when that comfort disappears, something uncomfortable begins to rise. Awareness. You see, an avoidant person survives by staying busy, disconnected, and emotionally unavailable. They avoid not just you, but themselves. Their patterns, their fears, their inability to go deep. But when you step back, when you stop chasing, when you stop giving them access to your energy, they are left alone with the one thing they've been running from their entire life, their own reflection. And that's where the shift begins. At first, it feels like relief to them. Finally, space. Finally, no pressure. But then something unexpected creeps in. The silence becomes heavy. The absence becomes loud. The emotional distance becomes a mirror, and in that mirror, they start seeing the truth they've been avoiding. They start seeing how they pushed you away. They start seeing how they avoided accountability. They start seeing how they sabotaged something real. And here's the key: this realization is not happening because you forced it. It's happening because you removed yourself. That's power. Because real transformation never comes from pressure. It comes from realization. And realization only happens in the absence of distraction. Your silence is not punishment, it's clarity. It's the moment where you say, I respect myself enough to step back from what doesn't respect me. And that level of self-respect is something they cannot ignore. Because people feel your standards even when you don't say a word. And suddenly the dynamic changes. They are no longer in control. They are no longer being chased. They are no longer being validated for doing the bare minimum. Now they have to sit with the consequences of their actions. And for someone who avoids emotions, consequences are the loudest teacher. But listen carefully, this is not about them changing for you. This is about you transforming for yourself. Because the moment you went silent, you didn't just create space in their mind, you created power in your life. You stopped begging for clarity and became clear. You stopped seeking validation and became valuable. You stopped chasing love and started embodying it. And that's the shift that changes everything. Because when you truly step into your power, you are no longer waiting for someone to realize your worth, you are living it. And ironically, that's when they start to see it. Not because you convinced them, but because your absence revealed it. Now, whether they grow or not, that's their journey. But your journey, it's about never abandoning yourself again. It's about understanding that silence is not weakness, that's discipline. It's strength. It's self-respect in its purest form. And when you master that, you become unstoppable. So don't break your silence just because it feels uncomfortable. Don't go back just because they're starting to wake up. Stay grounded. Stay centered. Stay powerful. Because sometimes the greatest transformation you can create in someone else's life is the moment you choose to walk away from it and transform your own. Silence has a way of doing what words never could. It removes the emotional safety nets that allowed the same patterns to continue unchecked. When you are constantly available, constantly explaining, constantly trying to fix things, you are unknowingly providing a cushion. Every time they pulled away, you reached in. Every time they avoided, you compensated. And in doing, so the cycle survived not because it was healthy, but because it was supported. But the moment you chose silence, that safety net disappeared. Now there is no one stepping in to soften the consequences of their behavior. No one chasing them to reassure their ego. No one over-explaining to keep the connection alive. And what happens when the distractions are removed? A person is left alone with themselves. That's where the real shift begins. Because silence creates space, and space creates awareness. For someone who is used to avoiding emotions, this space feels unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. At first, they might try to ignore it. They might distract themselves, tell themselves it doesn't matter, convince themselves that this is what they wanted all along. But silence has a persistence to it. It lingers. It echoes. And over time, it forces a confrontation they can no longer escape. They begin to notice the absence, not just your physical absence, but the absence of what you brought into their life, your energy, your presence, your effort. The conversations that once filled their day are gone. The emotional support they once leaned on is no longer there. And slowly that void starts asking questions. Why is it so quiet? Why does something feel off? Why does this feel different? And those questions lead to something deeper reflection. Reflection is powerful because it doesn't come from being told what's wrong. It comes from seeing it for yourself. And when there's no one left to blame, no one left to chase, no one left to project onto, the only direction left to look is inward. That's where they start recognizing patterns. They begin to see how they distanced themselves when things got real, how they avoided difficult conversations, how they took consistency for granted, how they expected understanding without offering the same in return. These realizations don't happen all at once, they unfold gradually, layer by layer, as silence continues to hold up the mirror. And here's the truth, this process only happens because you step back, not because you forced it, not because you demanded change, but because you removed the environment that allowed avoidance to thrive. Silence doesn't chase, doesn't argue, doesn't convince. It simply reveals. And in that revelation, a person is given something they've likely avoided for a long time, an honest look at themselves. That's the power you activated the moment you chose not to speak. When validation is always available, it becomes invisible. It loses its meaning, its weight, its value. And in a dynamic where you were consistently giving reassurance, attention, and emotional support, it created a quiet dependency, one they may have never acknowledged, but one they absolutely relied on. You were the constant. The one who checked in, the one who tried to understand, the one who filled the emotional gaps they refused to face. But here's what happens when validation is removed. Exposes everything that was hidden beneath it. The moment you stop giving them that steady stream of reassurance, something shifts internally. At first, they might not label it clearly. They might just feel a subtle discomfort, a sense that something is missing. Not necessarily you as a person, but what you provided. Because validation isn't just attention, it's emotional regulation for someone who avoids dealing with their own inner world. When they felt uncertain, you reassured them. When they pulled away, you reached out. When they gave less, you gave more. So they never had to confront their inconsistency. They never had to sit with the imbalance. Your presence compensated for what they lacked. But now, without that external validation, they are left without that emotional buffer. And that's where dependency becomes visible. They begin to notice the silence in places where your energy used to exist. The absence of your messages, your care, your effort doesn't just create distance, it creates awareness. Because what once felt normal was actually something they had grown used to receiving without effort. Now they feel the contrast. And contrast creates clarity. They start to realize that the connection didn't sustain itself. It wasn't effortless like they may have believed. It was supported by you. Your consistency, your patience, your willingness to stay even when things were unclear. And without that, they are faced with something unfamiliar, the responsibility of their own emotional state. There's no one there to soothe the discomfort. No one there to validate their distance or justify their behavior. And in that absence, they begin to feel something they've likely avoided for a long time: emotional exposure. They might question why they feel unsettled. Why do they keep thinking about the past? Why your absence feels heavier than expected. And slowly they start connecting the dots. They recognize that they weren't as independent as they believed, that what they called space was. Often avoidance and what they took for granted was actually stability being offered to them. That realization doesn't come from confrontation, it comes from contrast. Because when something meaningful is no longer present, its value becomes undeniable. And here's where the deeper truth lies: this isn't about making them miss you. This is about them finally seeing the role you played in their life without you having to explain it. Because explanation can be ignored. But absence is felt. It's experienced. It's processed in a way words never could achieve. And through that experience, they are given a rare opportunity to recognize their patterns. Not because someone pointed them out, but because they can no longer rely on someone else to cover them up. That's when awareness turns into understanding. And understanding is where real change begins. Control in a relationship doesn't always look obvious. It's not always loud, demanding, or aggressive. Sometimes it's subtle. It shows. Up in patterns when someone decides when to engage, when to withdraw, when to give attention, and when to disappear. And in an avoidant dynamic, this control often comes from distance. They manage the connection by keeping it on their terms close when it's comfortable, distant when it feels overwhelming. And as long as you kept responding, kept reaching out, kept adjusting to their rhythm, that control remained intact. But the moment you step back, something powerful happens to interrupt the pattern. No contact is not just silence, it's disruption. It breaks the predictability they relied on. It removes their ability to assume that no matter how inconsistent they are, you'll still be there. And when that certainty disappears, so does their sense of control over the dynamic. Because control depends on predictability. They were used to you showing up. They were used to you closing the gap. They were used to you maintaining the connection, even when they pulled away. But now, you're not playing your role anymore. And that's where the internal shift begins. At first, they may try to rationalize it. They may tell themselves that you just need space, that you'll eventually come back, that this is temporary. But as time passes and your silence remains consistent, that assumption starts to weaken. Now they're no longer certain. And uncertainty creates tension. They begin to question what's happening, why you're not reaching out, why the pattern has changed, why the dynamic feels different. And more importantly, they realize they no longer have control over how this connection unfolds. That realization is uncomfortable. Because when someone is used to controlling distance, losing that control forces them into a position they've avoided, the position of vulnerability. Now, if they want connection, they have to initiate it. If they want clarity, they have to seek it. If they want access to you again, they have to risk something. And for someone who avoids emotional exposure, that's a significant shift. They can no longer stay passive while benefiting from your effort. They can no longer keep the connection alive from a distance without investing in it. The dynamic has changed, and now the responsibility is no longer one-sided. And here's the deeper truth: this disruption is necessary. Because as long as the old pattern exists, growth is impossible. Comfort keeps people stuck. Predictability allows avoidance to continue. But disruption forces awareness. It forces them to confront the fact that they don't get to control access to you anymore. That your presence is no longer guaranteed. That your energy is no longer something they can tap into whenever it suits them. And in that realization, something shifts internally. They begin to understand that connection requires participation. That consistency matters. That effort cannot be one-sided. But none of this would have happened if you didn't step back. Because as long as you were available, the pattern stayed alive. Now, without your participation, the pattern collapses. And in that collapse, they are finally faced with the truth of how they showed up. That's the power of disrupting control. It replaces comfort with awareness. And awareness is where real change begins. Emotional distance has a way of revealing what closeness often hides. When you were present, talking, explaining, trying to work through things, the focus was always outward. The attention stayed on the conversation, the situation, the moment. There was always something happening, something to respond to, something to react against. And in that constant interaction, it became easy for them to avoid looking inward. Because as long as there is noise, there is distraction. But when you create distance, when you remove your presence and your energy from the dynamic, something shifts. The noise fades. The interaction stops. And what's left is space, pure, uninterrupted space. And that space becomes a mirror. Not a mirror you hold up for them. not one you force them to look into, but one that naturally appears when there is nothing left to focus on except themselves. Emotional distance strips away the external stimulation they relied on, and without it, they are faced with their own thoughts, their own behaviors, their own patterns. At first, this mirror is uncomfortable because it reflects things they've been avoiding. It shows them the moments they pulled away without explanation, the times they ignored your efforts, the ways they created confusion instead of clarity, the inconsistency, the emotional unavailability, the lack of accountability. It all starts to surface. And here's the key: this reflection is not coming from you anymore. It's coming from within them. That's what makes it powerful. When someone points out your flaws, it's easy to resist. It's easy to defend, to deny, to justify. But when you see those same patterns on your own, without anyone telling you, it hits differently. It becomes harder to ignore, harder to escape, harder to dismiss. Because now, it's not an accusation, it's recognition. They start connecting their actions to the outcome. They begin to see that the distance they feel now is not random, it's a result of how they showed up. They see how their avoidance created disconnection, how their silence caused confusion, how their lack of effort slowly eroded something that could have been meaningful. This is the moment where the narrative changes. Before, they may have believed that things just didn't work out or that the connection simply faded. But through this mirror, they begin to understand that their behavior played a role, that their patterns weren't neutral, they had consequences. And emotional distance gives them the time to process that, because reflection is not instant. It unfolds gradually. One realization leads to another. One thought connects to a deeper truth. And over time, the image in the mirror becomes clearer. They begin to see themselves more honestly, not the version they present to others, but the version shaped by their actions. And this is where something meaningful can happen, because awareness is the first step toward change. Not forced change, not temporary adjustment, but real, internal change that comes from understanding. And all of this begins with distance. Not because distance is meant to hurt, but because distance removes illusion. It removes distraction. It removes the ability to avoid. And in doing so, it gives them something they may have never truly experienced before: an unfiltered view of themselves. That's the power of emotional distance. It doesn't chase, it doesn't convince, it doesn't demand. It simply reveals. And what it reveals has the potential to change everything. Self-respect is not something you announce, it's something people feel in the way you move, in what you tolerate, and more importantly, in what you no longer accept. When you finally chose yourself, when you stopped overextending, stopped explaining your worth, stopped chasing someone who was inconsistent, you didn't just change your behavior, you shifted your entire energy. And that shift creates something powerful inside the other person: conflict. Because now they are no longer interacting with the version of you that accommodated their distance. They are facing a version of you that has boundaries, a version that doesn't bend just to keep the connection alive, a version that is no longer available on demand. And that difference is impossible to ignore. At first, it confuses them. They were used to you being understanding, patient, always there. They were used to having access without effort. But now, that access is gone. And in its place is something unfamiliar: your standard. And your standard silently asks a question they can't escape. Why did I treat someone like that who clearly knows their value? That's where the internal conflict begins. Because on one side, they have their pe, ive, yeru, che, en, yeru, patterns the urge to stay distant, to avoid discomfort, to protect themselves by keeping emotional space. But on the other side, they are now confronted with the reality that their behavior cost them someone who didn't deserve that treatment. And that realization creates tension. They start replaying moments in their mind, conversations they dismissed, effort they overlooked, times when you showed up fully and they responded halfway. And now, through the lens of your self-respect, those moments feel different. What once felt normal now feels inadequate. What once felt justified now feels questionable, because your silence is no longer just absence sets a statement. It tells them that you're not willing to settle for inconsistency, that you're not willing to carry the emotional weight alone, that you value yourself enough to walk away from something that doesn't match your level of effort. And that kind of energy forces them to look at themselves more honestly, because self-respect doesn't attack, it reflects. It doesn't argue, it reveals. And when someone sees that they fell short of a standard they now recognize as real, it challenges their identity. It challenges how they see themselves, how they justify their actions, how they define their behavior. They may start questioning, why did I pull away when things were good? Why did I avoid something that had potential? Why did I take consistency for granted? And those questions don't come from pressure. They come from contrast. The contrast between who you are now and who you were when you tolerated less. That's what triggers awareness. Because people don't just learn from what you say, they learn from what you accept. And when you raise your standard, when you embody self-respect without explanation, it forces others to evaluate where they stand in relation to that. Some will walk away, some will resist it, but some will feel it deeply enough to confront themselves. And regardless of what they choose, role is not to lower your standard to make them comfortable again. Your role is to stay aligned with the version of yourself that finally chose peace over confusion, clarity over chaos, and self-worth over validation. Because that's the version of you that creates real impact, not by chasing change in others, but by becoming the standard they can no longer ignore. There comes a moment when chasing no longer feels like love, it feels like exhaustion. When over-explaining no longer feels like communication, it feels like losing yourself. And in that moment, whether you realize it immediately or not, you're standing at a turning point. You can either continue investing your energy into someone who avoids it, or you can redirect that energy back to where it was always meant to go you. Growth begins the second you make that decision. Not when they change, not when they come back, not when they finally understand you. Growth begins when you stop chasing what's unclear and start choosing what aligns with your peace, your values, and your self-worth. Because chasing creates imbalance. It places you in a position where your happiness becomes dependent on someone else's response. Their attention dictates your mood. Their distance triggers your anxiety. Their inconsistency keeps you in a constant state of emotional reaction. And over time, without realizing it, you begin to lose your center. But the moment you stop chasing, you break that cycle. You take your power back from external validation and bring it inward. You stop asking, why are they acting this way? And start asking, why am I accepting this? And that shift in focus is where real transformation begins. Because now, it's no longer about fixing them. It's about strengthening you. You begin to see things more clearly. The patterns you once justified now stand out. The behavior you once tolerated now feels misaligned. The effort you once gave so freely now becomes something you protect and value. And this is where growth becomes visible, not in loud declarations or dramatic changes, but in quiet decisions. The decision to not reach out when you feel the urge. The decision to not respond to inconsistency with more effort. The decision to walk away from confusion instead of trying to solve it. These small, consistent choices begin to reshape your identity. You're no longer the person who chases clarity, you become the person who requires it. You're no longer the one who waits to be chosen, you become the one who chooses. And that shift doesn't just change your situation, it changes your standards. Because when you truly start choosing yourself, you stop settling for half-hearted connections. You stop accepting emotional unavailability as something normal. You stop trying to prove your worth to someone who isn't ready to see it. Instead, you align with what reflects your growth. And here's the powerful part: this transformation doesn't go unnoticed. When you stop chasing, the dynamic changes. The energy shifts. The roles reverse in ways you didn't expect. Because the absence of your pursuit forces the other person to confront something they've never had to before, the possibility of losing you. But whether they realize it or not is no longer your focus. Because growth has moved you beyond waiting. It has grounded you in something deeper, self-trust. You trust yourself to walk away from what doesn't serve you. You trust yourself to not go back to what once confused you. You trust yourself to choose peace, even when it feels unfamiliar. And that's the ultimate transformation. Because the goal was never to make them change. The goal was to evolve into someone who no longer needs them to.